Today we're talking about alternative gender identities. How is this different, Connor? What's different about this than what we've ever heard before in our lives? Well, maybe we've heard about it, but what's different? This part of the chapter. How do we usually think about gender? Yeah, I mean, we have some serious binary thinking going on in our lives, right? I mean, that is pretty much the way that we've been told about gender from the very beginning. When they have those gender reveal parties and they're firing off a cannon, they never, fire off the intersex cannon, right? It's either going to be a boy or a girl, and that's just the way it is. So most of our time we spend in a gender binary. Now, we may talk about the inequalities between that binary. We may talk about people crossing back and forth over that binary. We may talk about people who don't feel comfortable in the binary. But usually, for the most part, there are a few people who say they are gender non-conforming. But for the most part, when people do this stuff, it's in the binary. And so in this class, we're going to be looking both at alternatives to the binary, and then in the final little part of class, I wanted to ask if there were alternatives to gender, and that's why I sent you that article from Tom. I looked on his website. He pronounced his name, it's got that O, but he says don't say the O, so it's Belsdorf. Thomas Belsdorf's article about eliminating the gendered pronouns from the English language. Now, he says that won't eliminate gender, obviously not. And in fact, there are plenty of non-gendered languages that still have some super duper gender ideas, but it's the step in an alternative to gender itself. So that's what we're doing. Good thing Sean's here. Two-Spirit, Sean, you ready?
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
So these were people in Native American tribes. Identified as male and female. To the tribes people, they weren't viewed as differently. They were viewed as their own separate gender. Three genders, male, female, and two-spirited. When the Europeans came over, two-spirited people were frowned upon because they defied Catholicism and what they believed in and stuff.
Frowned upon. Yeah. Putting it mildly, yes. Many were persecuted, put to death with, the sanction of the church. And our anthropological term for what is now in some places, not all Native or indigenous communities in the Americas accept this idea of two-spirit, as a terminology for their ideas of gender. It's probably the most widespread and accepted, but it's not. Some prefer terms from their own languages. The term that we don't use anymore, but appears a lot in the anthropological literature, and they do mention is a term that the French used, which was a derogatory term for a male prostitute. And somehow that became the term that people would refer to this as in some of the writings on that. So we don't use that, we try not to use that term anymore, because yes, for the Europeans, this was seen as a huge problem and something to be stamped out and eliminated. One of the anthropologists who's probably done the most on this is an anthropologist named Will Roscoe, mentioned here in the text, who has talked about this as both a third gender that might be males performing female tasks or having their own special roles, and also fourth genders, females performing male tasks, having their own special roles. And there's various, I guess I really like this in some ways because people get so weirded out by some of the gender stuff that's come up in the last 2 or 3 decades, or maybe even 2 or 3 years. But a lot of this stuff was was more radical and more interesting long before the Europeans arrived. And I think, I forget if it was Will Roscoe who said that the Americas were the queerest continent ever, which is, you know, a kind of a strange modernism projected backwards. But the truth is that the gender roles were really were quite interesting and different, and we'll never, in fact, perhaps know a lot of this because so much of it was eliminated by colonialism. But some persist, and there are some efforts to recapture those roles in the present. So that's interesting stuff. They then go into the one specific example, which is not, I guess it is a third gender. That's kind of a funny example. The male gender variant role among the Mojave. Timur, what is going on here?
Yes, so basically when the child is born, he chooses his gender, he or she chooses his gender. And for boys, they act strangely on ceremonies. That would mean that they're trying to become alive, or
We're gonna go with that, yeah.
yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, this happens right before the puberty ceremony. The boy starts acting strangely. The parents try to not, you know, it's not like they're like good, you know, and so again, going back to the two-spirit thing, in some groups, this was seen as a special role. In other groups, it was seen as, you know, not the best thing, but they said, all right, fine. And then there's a bunch of things that they go into about the roles that this male gender variant would take, which perhaps seem a little bit strange to us today, but you know, we'll just roll with it in the sense that this is a different kind of gender system in which you have an alternative to the gender binaries that are said to exist. The Hijras, which everybody loves and knows about in India. Actually, this is kind of a fairly well-known case. They bring up a book by Serena Nanda called Neither Man Nor Woman, the Hijras of India. Danielle, what do you get out of this?
It was like a community where like the males and the dressed males. And I just talked about it because it was something that was right now. Like, there are people today who just like choose dresses like more feminine. But I never really like more of a religious community to like dress feminine. So I just thought that.
Yeah, the religious aspect was particularly striking here because apparently in Hinduism there are some sexually ambivalent figures to draw upon. So yeah, I'm trying to think if we have any sexually ambivalent figure to draw upon in Christianity. Not coming up with anything right now, but yes, there are definitely some different religious traditions to draw on. Now, one of you asked if how they are seen in India, and I think it's fairly clear they're not. This is not I mean, there are places where they perform certain rites and have a certain amount of respect, but it's a fairly persecuted identity. And then the sadhin, which I actually hadn't even heard of before, and as they say here, they're not as widespread, visible, or prominent as the Hijras. In fact, I looked up Serena Nanda's, she once wrote an article before this book, which was called The Hijras and the Sadhin of India, Neither Man Nor Woman. But as you can see in the book, it is mainly about the Hijras, in part because I think the Sadhin are more persecuted, less visible, and don't have that same kind of community as the Hijras do. Again here, though, another example of a third, perhaps fourth gender role outside of the binary, which is perhaps not entirely accepted, but at least acknowledged tolerated in certain parts of the world. Most people believe that, in fact, third and fourth gender roles, there are actually hundreds of examples of these. They're on every continent and in every time period. So this is actually something that is quite more widespread than we may have been led to believe. Another example here, which Matt's not here to tell us about, but another book by Serena Nanda discussing the sort of the interesting, how to say, transvestite beauty contests and other gender identities that have developed, especially in Thailand and the Philippines. Interesting because in some ways these draw on certain kinds of what we might call traditional identities, but they're also very influenced by the Western colonial gaze and ideas of beauty that are from what we might call what they call the global North and the United States. And so in some ways these are drawing both upon different gender ideas, but also on this globalized idea of what it means to be beautiful and glamorous in this situation. They then discuss, on the same page, intersexuality, which is actually not a thing. I don't mean that way. They should know better than this. What is intersexuality? Gabe.
Someone that's born with a body that's not classifiable.
Yeah, no, that's a trick question. That's intersex. They should know better than saying intersexuality. They've told us to distinguish between gender, sex, and sexuality. What would you be if you were intersexual? Leah's puzzled now. Yes, I was trying to figure out who an intersexual person would be. Yeah, that's, anyway, they should say intersex, really. You can speculate about intersexuality, that sounds fun. But intersex is, yes, someone who is born or develops characteristics, some of these aren't visible at birth, which are ambiguous or combining or different. And Gabe, you did some research about, well, how often? What do you find out?
One stat that's used by the Intersex Human Rights Australia group is 1.7% of the global population, which is like around the same like percentage as like redheaded people.
Right.
But there's like some disagreements about like who fits into that percentage. Like, what was the reasoning from the researcher? So another number is like 0.0018% of the global population,
Which would be a lot fewer than the redheads. Yeah. There has been a lot of debate about this, in part because some of these conditions actually that you might qualify as intersex do not have a phenotypical manifestation. Like, it's not like you are born with ambiguous genitalia. They are different kinds of chromosomal and genetic conditions, some of which might manifest later in life. So I was trying to get a sense of this. I looked at your link, Gabe. I was trying to get a sense for myself of what's going on. And I decided that, you can believe me or not, I decided that the upper bound is sort of born ambiguous couldn't really be 1.7%, because even in their own figures, some of that was later in life manifestations. But I decided that the lower bound, 1 in every 10,000, seemed a little bit too low in comparison to what's sort of going on genetically and chromosomally. So I decided on it probably about 1 in every 1,000, which is not a ton. A lot of this has been buried, so to speak, in that if someone is born with ambiguous genitalia, oftentimes what would happen in our society is you'd have a doctor conference and they'd make a decision and they'd do surgery and fix it. So you might never know. And that was the kind of, you know, and there are some conditions in which it does seem fairly obvious that there's an anomaly which can be fixed, but there are others in which the intersex community, which is perhaps growing, has said, let's not do the surgery so fast. Let's let it go for a little bit. One of the people that's been really prominent in these and gave us some of our upper bound estimates is Fausto-Sterling. Her book and works, she wrote an interesting article a while ago called "The 5 Sexes: Why Male and Female Are Not Enough." But she's been really interested in the ideas of how our gender binary makes us see sex. And over the years, I've been trying to figure out how to think about this. And my conclusion, or where I'm at right now, is that it really is true that the way in which we are trained to see gender as a binary makes us want to fit biological sex into that binary. Now, I'm not trying to say that biological sex isn't a binary. It is often a binary, but our ideas of gender make it more binary. That is, we are very interested in fixing things and making people show up on one side or the other of that binary when the biology is more complicated. So there are a lot of people who are, well, a lot. There are a fair number of people who are born with XXY or X0. These chromosomal and hormonal things may not manifest that much. People may live their whole lives not knowing that they are a chromosomal anomaly. But in general, we try to force people into one side of this binary or another. The intersex community, or the intersex, what was that group you said, Gabe? The intersex?
The Intersex Human Rights Australia group.
The Intersex Human Rights Australia group. So see, there's a group that, you know, are talking about people having, you know, we should at least, I think, as several of you put it, it would be nice to know about this. There's no reason we can't understand this in our sex education classes, except do we even do sex education very well anymore? Nah. All right. Then they talk about transgenderism. Again, there's no, what is transgenderism? They should know better than this. There's no such thing as transgenderism. That's like saying capitalism or Marxism or, no, it should be called transgender, right? That transgenderism is somebody who's like, I don't know what that would be. So transgender we do know about, right? The people who are transitioning, who might want to become a different gender than they were assigned at birth, may want to be non-gender binary, may want to do various things. You know, we know about this. There's a lot of issues that are still being worked out. They mentioned the Olympics and sports, and you know, the Olympics is one place where, and sports in general, where people really want to measure these things and put people into categories. And you know, there are reasons why people want to do this, but there's also a huge number of complications in this. When you start measuring like testosterone levels, for example, as they mentioned, there's a wide variation in terms of naturally occurring testosterone, both among females and males. Whether that gives you an athletic advantage depends in part on what event you're running. So there's a lot of issues here. we'll be working those out over the next few years. But I guess I would say that as these things are going on, let's just keep in mind that at least from a global cultural, historical, anthropological standpoint, there have been a lot of different kinds of things that we can do with gender. We don't need to be afraid of these kinds of ideas. And we have to recognize that, you know, one of the reasons people feel so uncomfortable sometimes is because of our society's imposition of the gender binary. If we just let things go, people might be more chill. Oh, this was fun. Queer identity and festivals. Those are always fun. Well, maybe. Danielle, what do you get out of this?
I pretty much got out that, you know, kind of like a ritual type community, but it's more so just like for people who are even like experimenting or want to figure out who you're not, and go and meet a bunch of people and eat vegan food as a community. It's just more so like an area where people of that, like can feel comfortable and express themselves through clothes, through expressions, and like having friends there and stuff like that.
Yeah, vegan food was pretty.
I thought that was weird.
It seemed weird. Yeah, I didn't want to. Didn't make me want to go.
Unless it's a thing in that community, I don't know. But I just thought it was weird.
Michelle, what do you think?
I found it interesting because they said these festivals are primarily focused for like promoting cultural codes and lifestyles and like the practices. And they had a huge influence on like who defines who belongs there to the extent of which person belongs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is, yeah, I mean, I think the idea of, and I mean, I think this is usually, the examples here are from European festivals. I'm not sure if we do the vegan food here. They said here that these might not even be vegans, but they do it at the, veganism is not necessarily practiced by them in their ordinary lives, but at the festival it becomes this identity formation. And I guess I would say that it does seem like these kinds of gatherings are hugely important if you are going to establish the idea of an identity. So in the last class on gender, I talked about how all over the world and all throughout time, there have always been acts that we might classify as homosexual or queer, but that doesn't necessarily translate or make possible an identity as such. And so the idea, you know, being visible, being with other people, being in an urban area is pretty critical to establishing the group identity here, which may be absent if it's simply kind of one person every so often in each town. So this is a pretty interesting section on identity formation. So I also sent you the article by Tom Boellstorff, who talks about how maybe we should give up he and she, the whole language. So I don't know if you've had this happen, but a lot of times people are talking about, before they introduce themselves, their preferred pronouns. You might see them in an email signature. And Belsdorf is not arguing against that. He says that that pronouns and saying what we prefer is a good thing. But what he says is they don't challenge gender exclusion, and that in some respects they further it. And it is something that I sometimes feel about when we go around and do our pronouns. If everybody just says the same thing, then it doesn't seem to create that space. And as he says, sometimes it's difficult to remember these. It doesn't solve the problem of what to call people you haven't met yet. And it's also if some, you know, it creates a number of issues. It's better than it was before, but in his view, it doesn't solve the problem. And so he makes an interesting statement that we're already, unlike some languages, which are very gendered in terms of every noun and every, well, especially every noun in say French or Spanish or much of German. English isn't like that. We're not as gender neutral as some languages, but we're close. And so he says that in terms of pronouns, we already have I and we, which are both gender neutral, and we have you, which is gender neutral. And so, you know, all we have to do, the final push is we just need to get rid of he and she. And he says, let's go with they, which is sort of happening anyway, right? And when we see this happening kind of on its own, it seems to be where we're headed. So we just need a final push to get it over the line. What do you think, Annie? Should we do this? Freedom, yeah, the freedom people. I do feel like there's going to be a freedom backlash here. I mean, it's already happening, the freedom backlash. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, that's why it's like, how do you do that? I mean, he wants to eliminate them, kind of, not eliminate them, but sort of bring our whole language up to the next level, which you can, I don't know actually how to get there. At the end, he says, I ask English-speaking cisgendered allies. I think that's me. I'm an English-speaking cisgendered ally, I hope. Cisgendered being someone who identifies with the sex gender they were assigned at birth, to give up she and he in the name of radical gender inclusion. What do you think? Thinking of going to they. What if I go to they? Will it change anything? Gabe says no. Why not, Gabe?
It's like
Oh, so you're saying it doesn't matter that much to go to they. Oh yeah, I agree with that. I mean, it's easier on the back side of the sentence, I guess. It's easier to say they, like on the end of this. What I mean by that is, I don't know if it's going to get hard. It's going to be difficult still for me to say they are, they is. Can I say they is? Yeah, that's going to be hard. I guess I have to still say they are. I'll be fine. No, I'll be fine. I guess I was talking about for me. What if I go to they for myself? What if I put that in my pronoun line now? Will it change anything? Yes, Leah.
expressing yourself, but more actually like. I feel like that. Such a different process, like why we have them, yeah, like why don't we just use they all the time?
Right. I asked my daughter if I should go to they. She's very into she's very interested in these issues, and we laughed because we said, well, it's not because I'm having issues. Like, I'm not about to go, I'm not having gender identity issues. I just want to know if I should go to they just because, that, but I don't know. Aaron, what would happen? Anything?
They may say that you're like identity, if you're doing it too,
Right. Right. Yeah. Okay. I guess I see. Well, my daughter said there were a couple there that she mentioned an issue, which I think Belsdorf mentions in his article, which is, those who identify as female and those who identify as women as a sign of like difference from men, and kind of embrace that as like, hey, this has been an unequal category and we need to preserve that category. So, but I think, so what you're saying is if I go to they, I'm kind of taking over a separate they identity. Some people might think that. Yeah. All right. I'm not ready to go to they then. We all have to do it together. Have to make the leap. I think you're right, because they has become somewhat, the people who are they want to be they, maybe. Huh. All right. Well, we'll work this out. Next couple of years, we'll have it all figured out.